God is faithful. Joseph's colourful story exudes a life of dreams, visions, and personal aspirations, given to Joseph through God's personal calling and direction. Yet in the excitement of it all, we're exposed to the anguish and cry of injustice, poverty, betrayal, and desperation as the young man with tenacity holds onto the promises God has given to him. Joseph is a story of hope, displaying God's faithfulness to bring his will to pass. We see Joseph in prison reflecting on his circumstances in Genesis 39:20-21. Joseph is falsely accused and has been stripped once again of his innocence to be confined to prison. Joseph is falsely accused and wants to be released, and eventually has the opportunity through interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh's servants. Joseph, through his trial, finds himself imprisoned by the will of God more than the will of man. The greatest example of this is that the butler who was released as per Joseph's interpretations of the dreams forgets to let Pharaoh know all that Joseph had done for him in prison. Genesis 40:23. The New Spirit Life Bible Study comments on Genesis 40:23 stating, "But forgot him stands in stark contrast to God who remembers Joseph. Although Joseph was forgotten by man, God has not forgotten Joseph." Another 2 full years of suffering pass while Joseph spends time in prison before the opportunity comes to see Joseph released. For ancient Israel, pioneers to the faith, trusting God would have been extremely difficult. They were nomadic. God had led them into that culture through Abraham, wandering through the land, dwelling in tents. Isaac and Jacob were born nomadic. They only would have known God as a provider through temporary settlements. They would not have experienced a settled down civilization. God to them would have seemed always moving and potentially changing his mind like their temporary accommodation. God, being faithful of his promise to Abraham and knowing the future famines that took place in 1740 to 1707 BC, prepared on behalf of the Israelites to go into Egypt, transitioning Joseph from his birth in Hebron to the city of Egypt. I believe God's desire was to protect Israel and to give them a great inheritance that allowed Israel to populate in number under the governance of the Egyptian civilization. Egypt was a large city and it had deserts all around it on 3 sides. And so for God's people, I believe that he used that as a great place for them to grow in numbers, and the Egypt was actually had a defense system around it. So other armies weren't able to conquer Egypt as easily as other places because of the deserts. They couldn't actually bring large armies through the desert. Like Joseph, Jesus suffered. Jacqueline Gray commented in her video on Isaiah about Jesus being the suffering servant, suffering for our sakes and benefit. We as a body and individually are made up of our own capacity as God wills to give. As believers, we all suffer, held by spiritual prison walls surrounding us, harassing us to serve our own ways and other gods. A great example is desiring to give our children a family home. In itself, there is nothing wrong with a new home for our family. Our Australian culture is built on that it's the right thing to do to own your own family home. And it's a great thing. But for God might be causing us through the Holy Spirit to actually not buy a home at this certain time. It may be that he knows what's coming down in the future financially. He might know that there's going to be a famine coming. Or God might be holding you off from buying your home because he has a greater one for you in the future and he knows what's going on. All of these things can make us feel like where is God in the midst of our anguish, in the midst of our trial. Our desire is for our children. Our desire is to see them grow and have a home. Yet God's saying, wait now. These things can feel like prisons. God can use constraints in our lives to keep us protected, to bless and teach us obedience. These trials bring greater joy and maturity. Jesus lived that life of joy, obedience, faith, and blessing. A life that demonstrates the heart's cry of both men, Joseph and Jesus, by saying, in my suffering, I still serve God. Me as a pastor and a leader, shepherding God's children, I can also feel like Joseph, ambitious and desiring to see the power of God move in my life, to see my family financially stable, to grow the local body, church, and I have a heart full of faith and courage to walk and demonstrate the power of God and His faithfulness. Yet at the same time held back by the constraints of God's timing and purpose, wrestling against the desire to take God's promised matters into my own hands, constraining myself from complaining, endeavouring to fight off fears and push past the challenge of not maturing, conducting myself in a pleasing way to Jesus, trusting God to fulfill the desires in my heart. We can all learn from Joseph and his actions through his suffering. Joseph's obedience was exemplary and is worthy to be actioned personally. Joseph's story is extremely relevant today and can be applied effortlessly into multiple areas of our lives while we hold on to life-giving promises that God has given us. Joseph's story is a story of faithful trust in an ever-loving God, no matter the circumstances. No matter what circumstances that you may have going through life, Jesus says, I tell you truthfully, I come that you may have life and life more abundantly. With these words, we hold fast like Joseph, and despite the circumstances we may find ourselves in, we say, and we imitate Joseph's actions as we stand and also declare out of our hearts and mouths, our God truly is faithful. Thank you. Encore.